Morning, friends. Let's start with a moment of silence. Thank you, friends. It's my honor to have been asked by Pamela to introduce her for this conversation initiated by the CPMM Library Committee on her book, That Clear and Certain Sound, Finding Solid Ground in Perilous Times. Many of us know Pamela in the Quaker community as a tireless worker for peace and social change, climate justice, and rethinking economic and financial systems. She's also an early childhood advocate and peer counselor who is passionate about relationships, integrity, paying attention, and all kinds of repair. She enjoys connections with Northern Ugandans, youth climate activists, childcare teachers, and urban farmers, among others. As a writer, workshop leader, and speaker, she seeks to demystify the connections between economics and daily life, to challenge people to claim their power and act on their values, and to wonder and thanks. She has published widely on faith, money, and economics, and on peace building and right relationship. Lead author of Toward a Right Relationship with Finance, Interest, Debt, Growth, and Security. She's also written Money and Soul, a collection of essays, and That Clear and Certain Sound, Finding Solid Ground in Perilous Times, and a volume of poetry, Alive in This World. We are so grateful to have this chance to hear you talk about your work, Pamela. In this next hour, we'll hear some reading, and friends are invited to put questions in the chat. We'll talk about Pamela's process and consider some of your questions and reflections, and finally hear from Rita and so let's start with the reading. Let's start with hearing your poetry. And if everyone can put themselves on mute, that would be great.
Well, actually, it's prose. So I'll just start right now with the first paragraph of the introduction, what rings true. Every now and then, I find myself engaged with life in a way that seems just right. I have a human interaction that is clear, connected, and deeply satisfying. I soak in a moment beneath a tree, pausing to look up and take in the vibrant color and striking light and shadow. I extend the life of something old and functional with a careful mend. I do a piece of work in the world that matters and clearly has my name on it. I take the hard next step that's waiting to be taken in a friendship. I use my good compost to transplant and give away a native pollinator. Something about what I'm doing rings true. A bell can't ring true when it's covered or padded or stuffed. To hear the ring of truth in our lives, it can help to strip down. What clutters our minds? What messages have we taken in from our childhoods, from advertising, from society at large that muffle the truth? What has accreted to our social institutions that keep us from discerning their true vocations? What layers of history, privilege, and inequality obscure the possibility of respectful and appreciative interaction in any situation? I treasure the words of John Woolman, a colonial Quaker. He advises us to dig deep, carefully cast forth the loose matter and get down to the rock, the sure foundation, and there hearken to the divine voice, which gives a clear and certain sound. So that's where the title of the book comes from. What if the central principle for organizing our lives was moving ever closer to what rings true? Skipping a little bit to the very end. We don't have to just wait for a miracle to hear the ring of truth more often in our lives. We can remember those moments and value them. We can look for where they most reliably happen. We can talk with our friends and get help working to reproduce the conditions that encourage them. We can dig away at the stuff that muffles them. There may be no work that's harder or more worth doing. And maybe as we keep trying, it will get less hard, and we'll hear that ring of truth in our lives more and more.
Wonderful. Thank you so much.
And I can go right
That was
on
great
to the
to hear
next,
about the title.
the title.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Windows and Reflections. Go ahead.
Yeah. So this is just, I wanted to talk a little bit. The first section of the book is called Windows and Reflections. And I could talk a little bit about my introduction to my writing process. So there's one, like I was cleaning a room in preparation for a meeting with folks that I really cared about. And it got me thinking about sacred spaces. I was noticed in the garden that I really didn't want to pull up my sweet plants to harvest them. And I thought about spending and saving. My computer needed a new battery, and it made me think about the right to repair. I had a really interesting experience babysitting a child I'd never met before, and that was the genesis of one on homemade play. And then having the music of the Messiah in my head after a Messiah sing got me thinking a kind of a different take on interior decorating. How do we kind of tend to the interior of our minds? So those are, that's a lot of how I write. Like something comes to my mind and then I start seeing kind of patterns and connections and I write a little essay about it. So I'll read the one just one of them that is When More is Less. When more is less. In stories of the old days, we read of different rare delights. The first greens after a long winter, the miracle of an orange, brand new shoes of one's own, a trip to town. We can almost taste the pleasure of such moments, the exquisite experience of luxury. Yet those pleasures are no longer ours. A trip to town doesn't even score as an event in most people's awareness. New shoes and oranges are nice, but hardly an occasion to feel blessed. The idea of a winter without lettuce is unthinkable. And we'd probably turn up our noses at those dandelion greens or whatever that our forebears were so thrilled to eat. Are we better off? In some ways, perhaps. Yet, when abundance breeds entitlement, we are the losers. I go to our community garden plot in the midst of the city and pick the first few little strawberries and feel like the luckiest person in the world. Then my husband loads up on big, fat transcontinental berries from the grocery store, and my paltry little handful loses all its value. I'm at a loss. Do I want to impose scarcity on my family? How can I help us be thankful in the midst of so much? When we joined a community-supported agriculture project, it was fun to walk the city streets swinging a basket of produce from the farm. But I was surprised when we stopped getting lettuce in July. The farmer said it was too hot for lettuce. I noticed how put off I felt by their inability to produce. Yet, what exactly makes me entitled to lettuce? When we move from appreciating something as a rare luxury to taking it for granted, to feeling ill-used without it, there is a steady loss of pleasure. Our ability to be thankful is diminished. I think I would be happier if I didn't feel entitled to lettuce. I think my family would be better off. if we didn't take California strawberries for granted.
Wonderful.
So Grace, you can jump in with
Listening
questions at
to
any
you
point.
talk about both your
Go ahead. Go ahead.
in listening to your reflections on your process of being present in life and having things rise and then beginning to write from there, it seems like the phrase rightly ordered comes to my mind, like the things that it's a natural springboard to write, and it feels correct. And I'm wondering, where does Quakerism and where does religion figure into these writings? Does it figure in at all? I mean, woman, that's a springboard I hear for the, but what was the genesis, and was there any of your spiritual foundation in the writing?
Well, I think that listening for what rings true is a pretty is pretty foundational. And so I think maybe it's a combination of paying attention. It's like showing up. So being present to the possibility of truth entering your life, and then listening for what has that that sound, or that what settles, like that idea of kind of pleasure, entitlement, thanks. It just kind of settled in my being. And I had this way of writing about it because I could talk about lettuce. I can't really just talk religious language. I really have to talk kind of how I'm experiencing the world in the moment. So it's like it's a so I think that's the springboard, what I see in the present, and then what settles, that's true, that just has that sense of truth. And then I just write. So I can go on.
Great.
The next section is on love and grief, which seems so totally connected. Like it feels like we can't really love fully unless we're willing to grieve fully. And a lot of the things in that section are kind of a little bit more about grief, but the one that called out to me is one about love. And I think this might have been in our newsletter at a time, and you might have read it, but I don't think it can hurt to read it again. It's called For Love of the Land. I've loved this bit of land for over 50 years. Coming up over the hill, my heart always opens anew to the jewel of a valley spread out below, part of the rolling farmland and woodlots of central New York State. My father bought an old farm here in the 60s, preparing for a job move. Preparing for a job move that didn't work out. But my family loved the land. Then the old farmhouse became a focal point for a group of young adult Quakers, a gathering and landing place as we attempted to shape lives that aligned with our deepest faith values. Our community loved the land. Then my mother moved up there in her retirement, and it became the center of family gatherings for her 6 children and growing extended family. My sister lived across the road on adjoining farmland and dug her roots in deep. When my mother died, it took us some time to decide that we needed to sell the house, but none of us wanted to sell the land. How could we ensure that it would continue to be loved as we loved it? My sister had been on her own journey, building ever closer relationships with members of the neighboring Onondaga Nation, and coming under the weight of our country's history of broken treaties, stolen land, and destruction of whole Indigenous nations. Living on traditional Oneida territory, she had started exploring the idea of a land trust with the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. used to be known as the Iroquois, of which the Oneida are a part. But as time passed with no visible progress, the outcome seemed increasingly uncertain. Then last fall, she met an Oneida woman who was working with other Oneida in Wisconsin and Southern Ontario to rekindle a shared traditional identity. A challenge, given that the only tiny remnant of their traditional homeland was now given over to a casino and entertainment complex. This meeting was the opening my sister had been waiting and hoping for. Over the next 9 months, they worked together to create a nonprofit organization, my sister consulting with her siblings, and we joyfully agreed to return that 30 acres to these Oneida women. At a ceremony the next summer, the 3 groups of Oneida women gathered on the land to mark its return. They sang to the land in its home language. They squished their toes in the wet earth. I can't imagine any better resolution, any better future for that land that so many of us have loved over all these years, and so many Oneida people had loved long before. I was already struggling to take in the terrible injustice of our nation's treatment of Native peoples, but being able to be part of one tiny thing that was so completely right has opened me up in a new way, both to the heartbreak and to the possibilities of healing.
Wow. It seems like you're inviting the reader into the stillness to consider these ideas. Your whole life has been oriented around social change and action, and even your Quakerism is not about philosophy; it's about doing. It seems that's where you thrive. And I'm wondering what you're hoping for, what you dream about. Response from your readers. Do you want to push them to social change, or are you inviting them in to reflect? It's almost like a meditation. What are your thoughts about that?
I think inviting people to settle in terms of kind of get rooted, and to let that clutter, the thing that I talked about the bell being muffled, because there's all this distraction and noise going on in our lives, and to just set that aside. And I don't know, it's the same thing. I think it's inviting them to listen as well. Maybe that's it. It's to look around, to listen for what, I don't know. It's interesting. I'm saying the same thing over again. Listen for what rings true. That's really, that does seem to be a common theme. And I think, like, to imagine a bigger, more open perspective, and to imagine new possibilities. It feels like there's something about our culture and our history and our sense of being constrained by all the things that are wrong around us, and you kind of need to kind of close in and protect yourself from all of that. And what if we just kind of expanded into everything that is right, and didn't pay so much attention to that stuff that's kind of insistently calling, in the airwaves, but just focused in on what's right and what's possible and what helps make us whole. And I think that's, is there any better way to do your social action than that?
Right. Rest as a radical.
Right. Yeah. Rest in a deeper reality.
Yeah.
And then take that as you move out into whatever your world or your day, whatever holds.
Yeah. Wonderful.
Okay. Oh, this is where we get a time for Rita. Rita, you're on. I wanted to have other voices, and Rita volunteered. So
Well, I love everything that Pamela has written, and I love her blog. It's one of my high points of the month every time it comes out. And well, I'm another kind of person that likes to look at what's going on and try to philosophize about it and to identify the patterns of the spirit working in the world. But the way Pamela moves into it, she's doing it. And I think there's a place for both of us in the picture. I'm recognizing that she's there. And well, let's take this word that she uses, getting down to the rock. Another word I would use is getting in touch with the inseparable oneness. And when we get really connected to that, we then have access to the whole, the vastness of it. And I see that is what Pamela is doing. That's what it looks like when you're doing it. And I'm talking about how to describe it, but that's where we need to go. I don't think anything on earth that we do is more important than doing that. And I love that Pamela is on the Eco Justice collaborative of PYM, where we're wrestling with a little bit of tug of war between how far to go with action. But when we follow this path, it leads us to the highest good. And any other, if we're being pulled in one direction or another, we need to bring that to this foundation and listen for the truth. And it's not coming from any one person. It's the wholeness. I could talk forever. I get excited.
Yeah.
It really aligns with the transition movement.
Right. Did you want to read that piece that you had in mind to read?
Let me get it up.
Well, maybe while you're looking for it, I saw that Stephanie had a question.
Pamela, I've read much of your wonderful writing. And here's my question. It feels to me as if there are that your written word can also be a message in meeting. And yet, I don't think that you speak very often at all. And I'm wondering about that.
Well, I think my writing, I reflect on it and I sit with it and I work at it and I try to get it really as clear and clean as I can. And it's not what you do in meeting. So I wonder if it would be good for me to do that more. It would be, it's not as easy for me. I think maybe that's the answer.
Well, your writing is a gift.
Mm.
And I'm merely asking a question.
Mm-hmm.
If I may, it seems that we may have the idea that a message in meeting comes spontaneously from within that hour, but I think some people mull on their messages for weeks or even months before the message has been clarified. And that's sort of the process that you do in creating a poem. So I'm wondering if the poems in process are, in fact, messages that you would feel ready to share in meeting.
Interesting. I'm listening. So Rita was going to read from the preface.
Okay,
And
and
then we'll
O
get,
has
we'll
a
get
hand up.
to. Okay, go ahead, O.
I just wanted to identify my experience of you, Pamela, is you live your message. My belief is you're always giving messages at worship because you do that all the time, is my personal experience of you. And so there's a place of delivering messages at meeting for worship. And yes, but when I first learned about Quakers and that statement that is said often, well, in the silence, when does your worship begin? And it's after meeting for worship. And so that's my truth and my experience of you. You're always actually in meeting for worship, and you're sharing messages all the time.
Okay, Rita.
Yeah, I'm just thrilled to see everyone recognizing what I'm seeing. It just feels really great, like communion. I'm going to read the preface, which is short. I could count on one hand the number of times our family missed going to Quaker meeting when I was growing up. At the same time, I would be hard put to remember even one conversation we had at home about religion. Fast forward to an attempt in middle age to communicate with a group of evangelical Quakers from Guatemala who were immigrants to Philadelphia. The opportunity to reach out across barriers of language was a compelling challenge. My Spanish is only passable, but I discovered that my real deficit was in the language of religion. That's all they were interested in talking about, and I found myself inexplicably tongue-tied. I had never learned to talk religion. All my training had been in the doing of it. In the branch of Quakerism I was raised in, there weren't that many things to believe. Truth is constantly unfolding in continuous revelation. We are called to be in right relationship, and there is that of God in every person. Thus, the practice becomes centering in to listen for truth, reaching out for that of the divine in others, and seeking a place of right relationship with others, with the world around us, and with the spirit that gives life to our world. Here then is a collection of meditations written over the course of many years in the non-religious language in which I'm fluent, on being alive in these wonderful and perilous times, trying to stay alert to the sound of truth, even in the most unlikely places, reaching for solid ground and stretching across barriers for the heart of others.
Thank you,
I
Rita.
think that's what we're all trying to reach
Yep.
when we're talking about religion.
So I wanted to say one other thing. I realized that made me think of something, which is that I think all of the essays in this book are from the blog that I write once a month. And when I first started it out, I was trying to think, well, who will I send this to? And I decided it made sense to send it to everybody that I know, my family, my neighbors, my colleagues at work, my old social change buddies, my friends, my Quaker community. And then I thought, well, what language can I speak in that would speak to everybody? And I thought I have to speak my own language, and I just have to speak it as fully and clearly as I can so that it will be accessible to all those people. And that's actually a discipline that I value a lot. Like, don't withhold my deepest values, but frame them in a way that might be accessible to everybody. So I think that's an important part of my practice, or the way I approach writing. So I want to go on to the next section, which is on separation and belonging. And I've chosen to read, I think, not quite the whole thing. I don't want to make you listen too long. So most of Bitter and Sweet, I leave out a little bit of it, but you can read the book. Bitter and Sweet. Bitterness and sweet tears were on my mind this summer. On the eve of a 5-day paddle down an unknown river early in the summer, we gathered for orientation at a campground on a native reserve in Canada. Everything and almost everybody was new. We closed with an elder sharing stories from her grandmother, and one sentence settled deep into my heart with the ring of truth. Her grandmother had said, "You have to cry till your tears are sweet. Grieve beyond the point of bitterness." Later, in the midst of a hard-fought national election, there was talk of bitter voters in our country. Politicians can try to sanitize that bitterness or gloss over it or pretend it's something that it is not. Or, much more problematic, they can feed on it for political advantage. But the advice of our native grandmother's grandmother, to cry till the tears are sweet, offers a way forward that rings with the sound of truth. Yet, how many of us just sneer at those who are drawn to the far right through a sense of betrayal and abandonment by the government and culture at large? Those who cling stubbornly to fear and hate-mongering leaders. In a liberal's attempt to scale this empathy wall, Arlie Hochschild explores the psyche of Louisiana Tea Party members in her book, Strangers in Their Own Land. She succeeds at evoking the feeling of what it's like to watch something that you have loved die. A bayou, the core of a small town, an industry that provided decent jobs, your hope for the future. Then try to endure without making a show of grief, without asking for help. A wise friend, an ex-factory worker who is committed to dismantling the class system, says that the heart of the project is learning to like each other. This is a tall order. There is much to be grieved, much to be overcome, much to be understood. I think of Hochschild and her admonition that we can see what they can't see, but not what we can't see. Only by growing together toward one another will we gain the clarity and strength to name our common enemy and stand against the real evils that stalk our land and damage all our lives. Bitterness is a hard, tight thing. It needs to be loosened by attention, by understanding, by tears. There are so many lost hopes and broken promises. There is such a strong sense of betrayal, of becoming invisible in one's own country. How much deep and open-hearted listening will it take for the tears of the bitter voters to run sweet?
Remarkable. You just seem to have a bottomless availability to hearing other people's pain. It's so obvious that the world is, but wonder, positivity and hope and
You're breaking up a little bit, Grace. Oh, I think you're gone. if somebody wants to say something while Grace finds her way back to us, that would be fine.
Do you have another piece you would like to share with us?
I do. I'm just thinking about if there's anything I want to say in the meantime. Well, I mean, we've kind of talked about it, but one of the questions that I've been asked is, as someone whose life has been oriented around social change, what are your thoughts about putting energy into a book of reflective and generally non-political essays when there's such pressing issues to be faced in the world? I guess I've kind of spoken to that already, that facing pressing issues from a sense of urgency and separation and ungrieved griefs and bitter fears is not going to get us very far. And we just really could use some grounding if we want to really be effective in our relationship with the world. So I feel a little shy about putting this forward, particularly to my more active social activist folks. But I think it's sound. So a little shy, but not thinking that I'm off track. Grace, I don't know if you're back. We lost.
I am back. I'm sorry. Can you hear me now? Are you all right? And so I wasn't sure if you heard my question.
We didn't.
Of,
We didn't.
To the world is perilous and horrific and, you know, divided, but your title is Perilous and Wonderful. And where does that source of joy and optimism and positivity come from?
Oh, well, it's everywhere, you know, it's everywhere. The
Says
trees,
you.
the trees, little things that grow up out of the ground, people who are kind. I mean, it's really everywhere. This other stuff is like laid over it, and it's kind of feels heavy and oppressive and everything. You know, I know a man that was important to me when I was younger who talked about the pseudo reality. It's like we spend our lives in this pseudo reality of news and advertising and consumerism and bad. And there are bad things that are happening in the world for sure, but there's also a reality of goodness, and it's just everywhere. It's everywhere. You just have to kind of be tuned into that channel to get it. You have to have that intention. That's another thing, you know, like what is my intention about where I pay attention? So I do want to keep track of what's going on in the world, and the fact that I am pretty interested in monetary systems is an indication that I'm not just off on a try to be happy path, but I think it's just there to be found. Berta had her hand up.
I have always been so grateful for your words and your presence. And it seems like sometimes we fall into these questions about theory and practice and religion and our relationships. And I think that sometimes we fall for too easy questions that keep using the same ideas of separation. And so I just wanted to lift up my gratitude for how you practice presence, which is in relationship to spirit infused through life, that's in life. That's the idea that there's a separation between being in creation and creating, which includes change and being changed, I think is one of those kind of false turns that we're used to making. And you continue to bring us back into the space of noticing. And so I just wanted to thank you. I always look forward to hearing your words and watching you.
So let's go on to hardship and hope. I just have to find it here. Oh, here it is. I really love this one, probably because I love the soil so much. Microorganisms and fertility. And I think it's short enough that I can read the whole thing. There's something about the earth that calls to me. I love the feel of a good, rich soil, knowing how it nourishes the plants we need in order to live. I love making compost, finding earthworms, breaking up clumps of earth with my hands to create a bed for new seeds. So it's been thrilling to read a book that links the fertility of our soil with our wealth. At one point, it talks about all the millions of microorganisms in every little bit of good soil. Those microorganisms have never gotten much respect. Scientists have been much more interested in how adding fertilizers, along with pesticides to kill the bugs that grow on the plants, can produce increased yields. But they also know that after a while, you have to add more fertilizers to get an increase, and then you have to add even more to maintain that yield. And then, even with such high dosages, crop yields start to decline. Why? It seems that all those fertilizers and pesticides kill off the microorganisms. So you end up with the soil as a sterile medium, useful only for receiving outside inputs and physically holding up the plants. For some reason, that's just not enough to make them thrive. Nobody seems to know exactly what all those microorganisms are and how they all work together. But it turns out that they're critical to the fertility of the soil. Well, this got me thinking. Lots of things get me thinking. None of those microorganisms make the difference by themselves. But that big community, all working together, creates something of enormous value. It reminds me of human communities, creating culture, creating wealth, creating a fertile place for people to thrive. But I worry that we're losing our fertility. The external inputs that seemed so hopeful when they were first introduced, the consumer products, the commercial entertainment, the advertising, are killing off the vitality of our soil. For a while, it seemed like more inputs led to increased well-being. But as the doses got heavier, the rate of increase in quality of life slowed down. And now, despite continued, ever more feverish expansion of external inputs, our well-being is steadily declining. The loss of good soil is a serious problem. It's hard to even get one's mind around the worldwide implications for feeding our planet in the face of such degradation. But I find reason for hope in my compost pile. It's not impossible to create good soil. It's not impossible to nurture the conditions that allow those microorganisms to find each other and start working their magic together again. Similarly, I think we need to take ourselves very seriously as the microorganisms of society. We don't have to accept our communities becoming an ever more sterile medium into which ever increasing doses of mass culture are necessary to prop up our ever more uniform lives. We can build up our resistance to those outside inputs, which are poisoning the soil of our communities. We can put our energies to interacting with each other and creating richness from that interaction. The process remains a mysterious one. We may not know exactly how it happens, but it seems to be true that we, working together with each other, are the only hope for a renewed fertility of our degraded culture. And maybe I should just go right on to the last one, unless,
Great.
yeah, okay, I just got to get my page number here. This one's a little longer, so I'm not going to read the whole thing. It's the last section, peril and possibility. And it's called Big Enough. I was having one of my not uncommon moments of feeling just too little. The world was looking pretty bleak and its problems pretty big. Economic inequality, racism, climate change. How could I possibly hope to make any difference in the face of enormous forces like these? I remember a pivotal aha moment about the relationship between the climate emergency and despair. And here it is. The feelings of despair that come up so quickly around climate change are not new. Those feelings were with us long before we'd ever imagined the possibility of the end of life on Earth as we knew it. They're old feelings from our childhood, when things were that scary and when we felt that small. I find the concept so refreshing. The feelings of despair that come up in the face of climate change are not inevitable. They are ours to change. The current situation is just an irresistible magnet for those old fears, which are always looking for a convenient place to attach in the present. I'm helped by recognizing a common trajectory behind climate change, economic inequality, and racism. It starts with the combined assumption of separation and a goal of mastery in relation to both other human beings and the environment. Those who have more justify their right to it, then they work to protect what they have. This attitude leads to injustice and trauma on a massive scale for both people and the earth. The systems that have been built on these foundations are enormous and complex, but underlying them are human dynamics that can be understood, faced, and changed. Systems that have been built can be dismantled, and people who have done damage and been damaged can be healed. So, what if this is just the right size challenge for grown-ups like us? What if each of us gets to be our own full, loving human self in relation to these big issues? What if we assume that we're big enough to look at what's wrong, to understand, to say what we think, to apply what we know to our personal choices, to engage with our friends, colleagues, and neighbors, and gather others around good programs, to be players on the public stage? In the process, we'll have to get good at teasing out the sticky old voices of despair from the reality of interesting and important challenges in the present. Those voices from our childhood may be the biggest thing that's holding back our world. It was true back then. We were too little. What good news that we're now big enough.
You have so much attention. You have so much capacity. Is that something that you were born with, or did you cultivate it? Seems like so much of your writing and your philosophy is about making space for attention, which leads to healing in all realms. What a message. What are you working on next?
Well, I have, when my children were little, I am a writer, so I wrote. And I wrote a column for our weekly newspaper for several years. And then I wrote more. And so I have this collection of parenting columns. And I thought, now there's a possibility. And so I have this publisher in Britain, John Hunt Publishing, which has this little Quaker Quicks imprint. This is my Money and Soul was part of that imprint, and that Clear and Certain Sound is part of that imprint. So I'm doing I'm going to have a book of parenting essays published in the winter. And what is Tending Sacred Ground, Respectful Parenting.
Oh
is the
my
title.
gosh.
And the other one is that after I read poetry, you heard some people who were here last fall heard my poetry, and I also read at my birthday, and I got such a good reception from that I thought, I've got tons more poetry. So I just went right out and thought of a different way of framing my poems. So I have a new volume in publication that's called Encounters with the Sacred and the Profane. And I'm thinking, gosh, there's more. There's more because I do write, and I do assume that anything that I write is going to be of use at some point. So who knows? Who knows what will happen after that?
Fantastic.
So the
Boy.
poetry book may come out this summer or fall. It's this little tiny publishing company that puts out the Quaker Institute for the Future pamphlets. So they're very nimble. John Hunt is a little more as a slower process. So we'll see which one comes out first.
Fantastic. Well, what do you think? We've got about 4 minutes. So maybe there's Stephanie, you've got a comment or a question?
Only a comment. When Pamela, you were talking about the fertilizer being ultimately not useful. Most of you know that I live at Taylor's farm, and Sylvia Taylor was married to Joe Taylor, who was the farmer at the time, Peter Taylor's grandfather. And Sylvia Taylor read oh dear, I'm forgetting the name. You can remind me of who this was.
Heard somebody.
What? Yeah. It was a book about how we were depleting the earth. She read it, and she decided that the farm, which had been using fertilizer, would no longer do that. It would be organic. And the earth here is really wonderful.
Yes, it's true. It's talk about truth. We got truth on our side here.
Yeah. And so Hal Taylor, Peter's father, was the farmer for a short bit before he died. And then there was a kind of interim that didn't work out very well. And now Peter Taylor is the farmer. And usually our own property isn't cultivated. I mean, across the road, it certainly could be. And this year, I think it will be, with sunflowers and lavender.
Ah, so nice, Stephanie.
Yeah.
So we have Mona and Shelley. Maybe we can see if we can fit them both in before we close up.
Thanks. Hi, Pamela. I'm aware of how your writing reveals a very calm self, and your presence and actions in our meeting also reveal a very calm, centered self. And my own experience and my perception of many other people who are awake to what's going on in the world is that we're often exhausted and sometimes bitter, sometimes having trouble seeing the good in others. I wonder how you stay centered, if you have a spiritual practice that helps you stay centered, I wonder, having spoken about crying until the tears run sweet, I wonder if practicing lamenting helps you stay centered. What are some of your secrets?
Well, I'm engaged in a peer counseling process where I exchange time with other folks with the openness to raging and grieving and quaking in fear. And so I've done a lot of lament. I would really, really encourage it. Yeah, but that's been critical, I think, to my well-being. That's the really brief response. I just wanted to check if Shelley, if you still want to
Thanks.
jump in.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me? Okay, I just wanted to introduce myself, member of Swarthmore Friends meeting, and maybe after the recording, if this were like an in-person talk, I might introduce myself and talk further about how inspiring I find your writings. But I just wanted to share that I'm glad to hear you talk about a return to writing on parenting, because it's through the book, Quaker Paths to Parenting. You had some commentary at the end that I just happened to pick up this spring, and I had a nephew just turned 18 who was with us for 18 months from, 18 months from Massachusetts. And you had written about having a foster son, a teenage son in your family at the end of that book, Paths to Quaker Parenting. And it so resonated with the experience my family had just had with my nephew, who had returned to Massachusetts. I read it at a small worship gathering, and a mutual friend had said that she knew you. I had just read it because it was so inspiring to me. And so it turns out I just really feel the need to speak to you personally to learn more from you. And one comment on what's been shared. There's so much that's so rich and deep that's been shared about reversing settler colonialism and listening to one's heart. You use the word settle in a very deep positive sense as a response to one of the early questions of what you wanted from your readers, and that was to settle. And what's somehow resonating for me is that it's sort of a very loving and deep unknowing in the paradox of how can we be ourselves, we who are settler colonialists seeking to correct collectively. And the answer is to settle and go with the inward voice. And there's an activist and writer called Sarah McLean Bicknell on the West Coast, who's done work with Indigenous groups, and she's British. And I heard her speak at a webinar this year, and she said something that resonates with what's happening today, where she said those of us who are European and trying, and she was born in England, and she said our language of the soul is poetry. So we may witness that there's a soul language that's indigenous, that's not ours, that we are helping collectively to reclaim. But as we seek what's ours that's not invasive, we can turn to poetry. And so I just wanted to end on that note, and such appreciation for everything that's been shared by everyone today. And my teenage daughter was on for most of this call. And I just look forward to sharing your writings with her as I learn from them as well.
Thank you. I put my email in the chat, and Nicole is going to put away the book in the chat. I can't stay afterwards. I have something else to ask you, but thank you. I look forward to being in touch.
Thank you very much.
So Grace, do you have closing words, or do we just go right straight to Nicole?
I think that Shelley really closed it nicely with great appreciation and a yearning for deeper connection with you and your work. So yeah, I think Nicole has put the link to where we can get it. Nicole, you want to comment?
Sure, yes. So the book is available at quakerbooks.org, also bookshop.org. And there are 2 copies in the library, so we encourage people to check them out. Feel free to contact the library by calling or emailing us, and we can get you set up with that book. So thank you so much, Pamela and Grace.
It was a pleasure.
All right, I'm going to
And
shut the recording off. Thank you,
Yeah.
everyone.
Yeah,
Thanks,
and I'm really
everyone.
sorry I have to run. I got something I got to do, but it's been a pleasure. Bye-bye.
Indeed. Take care.